The reporter leaned forward, notepad in hand, and asked the question innocently enough. He wanted to know about the general's pearl-handled revolvers. The general's eyes went cold. "They're ivory," he said, each word landing like a rifle shot. Only a pimp from a cheap New Orleans whorehouse would carry a pearl-handled pistol. That was General George S. Patton, Jr., and if you think you already know this man, I promise you, you don't know the whole story. Because those revolvers, they weren't decoration, they weren't showmanship, they weren't a prop, they were a biography. Each notch carved into that ivory, each scratch in the steel, each drop of blood they'd drawn, they told a story that started 30 years before the first German panzer rolled into France. A story that began in the Mexican desert, on an Olympic firing range in Stockholm, and in the soul of a man who believed with absolute certainty that he had been born to fight. Today we are going to follow those guns, from the day a young lieutenant bought one in El Paso, Texas, to the moment they were laid to rest behind glass in a museum, still waiting for a fight that would never come again. If you want to understand Patton, really understand him, you have to start with the ivory. Before we go any further, if you love military history told the way it deserves to be told, with the truth, with the detail, with the weight these stories carry, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell, because every week we go back into the fire. George Smith Patton, Jr. was born on November 11, 1885, in San Gabriel, California, and from his very first days, he was surrounded by soldiers. His grandfather, George Patton, Sr., died leading a Confederate charge at the Third Battle of Winchester in 1864. His father knew generals. His uncles had worn uniforms. War was not something abstract or distant in the Patton household. It was the family business, the highest calling a man could answer. Young George grew up reading Caesar, Napoleon, Hannibal. He studied their campaigns the way other boys studied baseball scores. He had a learning disability that made reading difficult. We would probably call it dyslexia today. But he pushed through it with raw, grinding will, the same will that would define everything he ever did. He went to the Virginia Military Institute for 1 year, then to West Point, where he graduated in 1909, not at the top of his class, but near the middle, held back by mathematics. What he lacked in academics, he more than made up for in something that can't be taught. He had presence, he had fire, and he had an obsession with the history of warriors that went back thousands of years. He wasn't just interested in warfare the way a scholar is interested. He was convinced, and he said this openly, that he had lived before, as a Roman legionary, as a soldier of Carthage, as a man-at-arms under Napoleon. He felt it in his bones whenever he walked on ancient battlefields. That isn't madness. That is a man who has made himself, quite literally, out of history. And the weapon of that history in his mind was not a rifle. It was not a cannon. It was a handgun, a sidearm carried by an officer who leads from the front, who stands where the men can see him. In 1912, at the age of 26, Lieutenant George S. Patton represented the United States Army in the very first modern pentathlon at the Olympic Games in Stockholm, Sweden. He was the only American among 42 competitors, all of them military officers from around the world. The modern pentathlon was designed to represent the ideal soldier. It included pistol shooting, swimming, fencing, equestrian riding, and a cross-country run. The idea was that these were the skills a courier officer might need to survive carrying a battlefield message through enemy lines. Patton threw himself into preparation with the kind of intensity that scared the people around him. He trained aboard the ocean liner crossing the Atlantic. He fenced, he ran, he fired at targets for hours until his hands ached. In the final standings, he finished 5th overall, first among non-Swedish competitors, in a field of 42 of the finest military athletes in the world. But here's the part of the story that doesn't get told enough. In the pistol shooting event, Patton finished 21st. It cost him the gold medal. The judges ruled that one of his shots had missed the target completely. Patton insisted, calmly and furiously, that he hadn't missed at all. He argued that his shot had been so accurate, so precisely placed, that the bullet had passed clean through a hole already made by an earlier round. The target paper could not show 2 separate holes. The judges had no way to prove him wrong or right, and the score stood. Was Patton telling the truth? Most firearms experts who've studied this case believe he probably was. He was a gifted marksman who had practiced that discipline obsessively. Shooting through a previous bullet hole is a documented phenomenon in precision competitive shooting. But the era had no technology to settle it, and the judges held their ruling. It was the gun that almost won him gold. And it was the gun that would define him for the rest of his life. 4 years after Stockholm, the United States found itself drawn toward the first of its great 20th century conflicts. Not in Europe, not yet, but south of the border, in Mexico. In March 1916, the Mexican revolutionary Pancho Villa crossed the border and attacked the town of Columbus, New Mexico, killing 18 Americans. President Woodrow Wilson responded by sending a punitive expedition of 10,000 troops into Mexico under the command of General John "Black Jack" Pershing. The mission: find Villa, capture or kill him. Among Pershing's aides was Second Lieutenant George S. Patton, 30 years old, desperate for combat, burning to prove himself. Before crossing the border, he stopped in El Paso, Texas, at the Shelton Payne Arms Company. He ordered a brand new Colt single-action Army revolver, the famous Peacemaker, chambered in .45 long Colt. It was the same model that had served the U.S. cavalry as its official sidearm from 1873 to 1892. The same gun that had become the symbol of the American West. It fit Patton's hand like it was made for him. He had it customized. He had it engraved. The ivory grips were fitted by craftsmen who understood that this man did not carry tools. He carried symbols. He wore it on his hip as he rode into Mexico. For weeks, the expedition chased ghosts. Villa was elusive, the terrain brutal, the intelligence unreliable. The mountains of Chihuahua swallowed entire patrols without a trace. Then came May 14, 1916. Patton had been assigned, somewhat unglamorously, to a foraging mission, buying corn from local ranchers for the Army's horses. He was traveling with a corporal, 6 privates, a civilian interpreter, and 2 civilian guides, all in 3 Dodge touring cars. He happened to be driving toward a ranch near the town of Rubio, one he had searched the week before. Something made him stop. A feeling, an instinct. He had heard intelligence that Julio Cardenas might be in the area. Cardenas was one of Villa's most dangerous lieutenants, commander of Villa's personal bodyguard, an elite unit known as the Dorados, the Golden Ones. Patton decided to investigate. He deployed his cars to block the exits from the hacienda, an early armored flanking maneuver, improvised on the spot, that would in retrospect look like a preview of the tactics he'd use with tanks 25 years later. He approached the ranch on foot. What happened next was the closest thing to a Wild West gunfight that the United States Army would see in the 20th century. 3 men burst out on horseback, carbines firing. Patton, standing in the open, drew his Colt and fired. 5 shots. At one of the horsemen, at close range, no more than 50 or 60 feet, he hit Cardenas and his horse. The horse went down. Another man rode straight at him at closer range, 10 feet, and Patton fired again, hitting the horse, sending both horse and rider crashing to the ground. When the man tried to stand and raise his weapon, American riflemen finished him. The 3rd horseman tried to flee. Soldiers cut him down. Cardenas, shot multiple times but still fighting, was finally brought down after faking a surrender and reaching for his weapon a 2nd time. 3 Villistas dead. The bodies of Julio Cardenas and his 2 men were strapped to the hoods of the Dodge touring cars, like deer after a hunt, and driven 90 miles back to Pershing's headquarters. The newspapers went wild. The story of the young lieutenant who had fought a pitched gunfight against Pancho Villa's personal bodyguard, armed with a cavalry revolver, and won. It was front-page news across the United States. Pershing was pleased. He gave Patton a nickname, Bandit. And Patton, alone with his Colt that night, took out his knife and carved 2 notches into the ivory grip. One for each man he was sure his bullet had found. He also made a decision that night. As General Joyce would later confirm, he would never again go into the field with only 1 gun. The firefight had been terrifyingly close. Too close. From that day forward, George S. Patton would always carry a backup weapon. The United States entered the First World War in 1917, and Patton went to France as Pershing's aide. But he didn't stay a staff officer for long. He saw the new machines arriving on the battlefield. tanks, and recognized immediately what they could do. He begged to be assigned to the Tank Corps. He got his wish, built the first American tank training school from nothing, and led his men into combat at the Battle of Saint-Mihiel in September 1918. He was wounded at the Meuse-Argonne offensive, shot in the thigh while on foot, directing tanks in the open. He refused evacuation until the attack had succeeded. Then the war ended. And for Patton, the years between the wars were almost a kind of death. He watched the army shrink. He watched tanks get sidelined. He pushed for armored doctrine that nobody wanted to hear. He studied. He translated French military manuals. He wrote. He argued. He waited. And in October 1935, while stationed in Hawaii as a lieutenant colonel, he ordered a second gun. He wrote directly to Smith & Wesson. He wanted one of their new registered Magnums, the most powerful production handgun in the world at that moment, chambered in the freshly developed .357 Magnum cartridge. It had a 3.5-inch barrel. He paid $48 for it with an Army officer's discount. He had it fitted with ivory grips initialed with GSP. He designated it, in his own words, his killing gun, to be drawn only in the most extreme battlefield emergency. Now he had two, the old Colt for every day. The Smith & Wesson Magnum for the worst moments of war. He wore them together on a custom gun belt made by S.D. Meyer's saddlery. He looked like a cavalryman from another century, which was exactly the point. When America entered the Second World War after Pearl Harbor, Patton's moment finally came. He was 56 years old. The tanks he had spent 2 decades arguing for were now rolling off American factory lines by the thousands. And at last, somebody gave him an army to command. He landed with the Western Task Force during Operation Torch in November 1942, hitting the beaches of North Africa in full battle dress. Ivory revolvers on his hips, helmet gleaming, riding crop in hand. His officers had seen the photos. His men had heard the stories. When they saw him standing in the open, directing the advance like a man who had no concept of his own mortality, something happened to them. Something that cannot be manufactured or faked. They believed they could win. That is what those revolvers were. Not vanity, not theater. They were a promise, made visible. A general who carries a revolver into combat, who stands where the bullets fly, is a general who has put his own life on the same line as every man under his command. Patton understood this with mathematical certainty. He knew the psychology of soldiers. He knew that men will follow a man who seems unafraid, all the way to the gates of hell. And he was unafraid, not because he was stupid, but because he genuinely did not believe he would die until God was finished with him. He nearly proved himself right, repeatedly. After America's embarrassing defeat at the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Eisenhower handed Patton command of all U.S. forces in Tunisia. Within weeks, the Third Army was a different organization. He imposed discipline with the fury of an Old Testament judge. He screamed. He cursed. He fired officers. He handed out fines for soldiers not wearing their helmets. He was impossible and exhausting and exactly what was needed. In Sicily that summer, he drove his 7th Army across the island in a race against the British 8th Army under Montgomery. He covered more ground faster than any American force had yet moved in the war. The ivory-handled Colt was on his hip for all of it. There was an incident, the slapping incident, 2 of them, in which he struck soldiers he considered cowards, men suffering from what we would today call combat stress. It nearly ended his career. Eisenhower came within a breath of sending him home. He was publicly humiliated, forced to apologize before his troops. It was one of the most painful periods of his life, but they didn't send him home. They needed him too much. And he came back. In the summer of 1944, after the breakout from Normandy, Patton was given command of the Third Army. What followed was one of the most spectacular, sustained military advances in the history of warfare. His army raced across France at a speed that left the Germans scrambling, covering ground that military planners had projected would take months in a matter of days. He was consuming gasoline faster than supply lines could replace it. He was fighting on borrowed fuel, borrowed time, borrowed everything, and winning. Then came the Battle of the Bulge, December 1944. Hitler launched his last great offensive through the frozen forests of the Ardennes. American forces were cut off, surrounded, under brutal attack at a town called Bastogne. The 101st Airborne was holding on by their fingernails in temperatures that froze rifle actions and killed men in their foxholes. Patton did what every military scholar said was impossible. He pulled his army out of an active engagement, turned them 90 degrees, and drove them north through ice and snow to relieve Bastogne. In less than 72 hours, his men marched through conditions that would have broken most armies. They arrived in time. It is still considered one of the most brilliant feats of logistical and tactical audacity in military history. When Patton arrived at Bastogne, he was wearing those revolvers. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was dying. Germany was collapsing from both directions. Patton drove his Third Army into the German heartland, crossing the Rhine, liberating prisoners of war, uncovering the first Nazi concentration camps, sending reports back to Eisenhower that left hardened men weeping. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered. And somewhere in all of this, Patton's war was over. He was made military governor of Bavaria, a role he handled with his customary subtlety, which is to say, badly. He made controversial public statements about the post-war treatment of former Nazis that scandalized the Allied command. He made worse statements about the Soviet Union, who were now supposed to be friends. He was relieved of command of the Third Army in October 1945 and given a desk job, essentially writing the history of the war he had helped win. He was 60 years old. He was lost without battle. He had said it himself, out loud, more than once. There's only one proper way for a professional soldier to die, the last bullet of the last battle of the last war. But the last battle had come and gone without a final bullet for George Patton. On the morning of December 9, 1945, Patton agreed to go pheasant hunting with his chief of staff, Major General Hobart Gay. It was a small thing, a day off, a chance to breathe. His staff car, a Cadillac, headed out through the wintry German roads near Mannheim. Then, at an intersection outside the city, at low speed, his car collided with a U.S. Army truck turning into a depot. No one else was seriously hurt. Patton in the back seat was thrown forward. He struck his head on the partition separating the front and rear compartments of the vehicle. His neck broke. He was paralyzed from the shoulders down. He was rushed to the 130th Station Hospital in Heidelberg, 12 miles away. The doctors stabilized him. His wife Beatrice flew in from the United States. He held on. He seemed for days to be improving. He asked about what was happening. He joked. He read. Then, on December 21, 1945, the shortest, darkest day of the year, General George S. Patton, Jr. died in his sleep. A blood clot had traveled through his paralyzed body and reached his heart. He was 60 years old. The man who had survived 3 wars, who had been shot through the thigh in France, who had stood in the open during artillery barrages in North Africa, who had fired a cavalry revolver at 3 armed horsemen in the Mexican desert, died in a hospital bed in Germany, 12 days after a low-speed traffic accident. His granddaughter Helen Patton would say, 80 years later, standing at that intersection in Mannheim, a life of immense brightness closed on the year's dimmest day, as though the world itself was pausing in this shadow to mark his departure. He was buried on Christmas Eve, 1945, at the Luxembourg American Cemetery near Ham, at his wife's insistence, among the soldiers of the Third Army who had fallen at the Battle of the Bulge. He rests there still. Row upon row of white crosses and stars of David surround him, the men he drove into the fire, the men who followed those ivory revolvers all the way to the end. Now, about those guns. After Patton's death, his family ensured that his most personal effects were preserved. The Colt single-action army, the one he'd bought in El Paso in 1916, the one that had notches for Julio Cardenas and his men, the one he had worn on his hip through North Africa, Sicily, France, Germany, and the Smith & Wesson .357 Magnum registered Magnum he'd ordered in 1935, both with their ivory grips and GSP initials, were eventually placed on display at the Patton Museum of Cavalry and Armor at Fort Knox, Kentucky, along with the original leather gun belt and holsters. Millions of Americans have stood in front of those guns over the decades. They are small. They look almost fragile under museum lighting. You have to remind yourself that these are not replicas. These are the actual weapons. These are the guns he was wearing when he walked into the ruins of Kasserine. These are the guns he had on his belt when his Third Army crossed the Rhine. These are the guns that fired in the Mexican desert on May 14, 1916, in what would be one of the last cavalry-style gunfights in American military history. And this is why they became more famous than his tanks. Tanks are machines. They can be mass-produced. They can be replaced. The Sherman tanks that Patton drove across France have been melted down and recycled into something else. There are no Shermans left that carry his particular genius inside them. But those revolvers, they carry something else entirely. They are physical objects that were present for every turning point of one man's extraordinary life. They are evidence. They are proof that he was real, that he stood where the bullets flew, that he did what the legend says he did. When George C. Scott wore replica versions of those revolvers in the 1970 film, and the actual guns were used in that opening scene, and spoke the line that every American over 60 knows by heart, he was channeling something true. The line was real. The guns were real. The man was real. And the anger behind that line, that icy fury at being called pearl-handled, that was also real. Because in Patton's mind, pearl handles were decoration. They were status symbols for men who wanted to look dangerous without being dangerous. Ivory was different. Ivory had been earned. Ivory came from something that had once been alive, that had fought to survive, that carried its own ferocity. You don't put ivory on a gun unless you mean it. George Patton meant every word, every bullet, every mile, every frozen night in the Ardennes, and every burning afternoon in North Africa. He meant it all. And 30 years from now, when the last person who ever stood in front of those revolvers behind museum glass has gone, someone will read about them. Someone will look at an old photograph, a general in riding boots and a polished helmet, ivory gleaming on his hips, and feel something they can't quite name. That is what a legend does. It outlasts the man. It outlasts the tanks. It outlasts the war. The guns are still there. He is still watching. If this story moved you, if you believe that history like this deserves to be told with the respect and depth it earned, then subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below. What do you think made Patton truly irreplaceable? Hit the like button if this video meant something to you, and ring that bell so you don't miss what's coming next. Because next week, we go back into the fire. And the story gets even deeper.